So now we're going to move on. Ni'n symud ymlaen nawr i'r panel hinsawdd, to the climate panel. And I'm going to bring on Cian Ciaran. Here he is. The unsung hero of Yes Cymru. Siwr i ti, Cian, ti'n iawn?
Iawn, diolch.
Iawn. So, ti'n mynd i arwain ni ar banel yr hinsawdd a colled natur a y del werdd newydd. Fi newydd gyfieithu hwnna ar y spot, so fi'n gobeithio oedd hwnna'n iawn.
Da iawn.
Diolch yn fawr.
Gall job nos ni'n neud, de.
So yeah, so I just hand up popeth draw i ti. I'll hand everything over to you now for you to bring the rest of the panelists on to have your climate discussion.
Okay, diolch Carys. Diolch pawb. Welcome, a warm welcome to everyone who's sitting at home. For those who are just arrived, if at any point you need translation from Welsh into English, there's an interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. And the chat is there for chat amongst each other. And then if you do have any specific questions to the panel during the course of the discussion, please use the Q&A option, and we'll do our best to come to those questions at the end of the discussion. Maybe while you're in the chat, maybe just let us know where you're from today. So if you're Tony from Tongwynlais or Geraint from Whelan, let us know, so we get a picture of who's attending today. So I'd like to start by welcoming the panel. Donal, Whelan, we've got Duncan Fisher, Katie Gallogly, Swan, Rajsri, Saikrishnan, and Sam Ward joining us today. A warm welcome and thank you so much for joining us, giving us your time. Dwi am dechrau osgau efo Sam Ward. Sam, welcome. I won't talk. I feel like I've talked enough as it is. I'm new to this job. So, Sam, please, if you just give us a few words of the background for the audience, and perhaps the floor is yours. Diolch.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Sam Ward. I'm I grew up in Northeast Wales, and it's my home, but I've been working and traveling and running businesses and organizations all over the world. But I've quite recently come back home, which makes me very happy. And I'm running Climate Cymru, which is Wales's leading national sort of campaign focused on the climate and nature emergencies. And that's the context that I'm here today. Do you want just a quick intro now, or do you want me to launch into my bits? Should I hand over to the other panelists?
Oh, well, I'll come to you in turn, I think. It'd be nice if you've got a presentation for us, I believe.
Yeah. And then I'll need my screen. Okay. Okay, let me launch into then a little bit of an overview first of what Climate Cymru is all about, and then we can tie it into this whole sort of broader debate that we've got going on today. So Climate Cymru, I just mentioned, it's it's a Wales focused and Wales-wide campaign to focused on the nature and climate emergencies. And so, yeah, just like a few alignment on what exactly we're about. So to the basic purpose in the short term is to apply democratic pressure on the Welsh and UK governments to make meaningful, evidence-based and fair commitments at COP26. And I know some of you will obviously know all about COP26 and a number of you may not, so I will get to that. So apologies if I'm using acronyms, but I'm going to explain, but it's a big conference coming later this year. So what do the people of Wales care about? And that's what we're sort of building our campaign about. It's not really about a set specific policy asks. We're really sort of asking people to align with a basic principle that just says well, I'll put it right there on the screen. I believe the climate and nature emergencies require urgent action, and these actions should be guided by the best available evidence and the voices of people across Wales. And so for anyone who's basically aligned, it's quite an easy thing to get behind. And beyond that, it's really about asking the people of Wales what they care about, and the organizations and the businesses of Wales what they care about, and then using those voices to as our mandate, as our communication to the people in power. And so yeah, so just that's the basic gist of what we're building it all around, is feeding it. We have an ongoing dialogue with MSs, with MPs, with councillors, with the Welsh Government, as a sort of leading Wales focus campaign, and we're very active with a coalition of organisations, and we're making sure, though, through that process, that the voice of Wales is not lost in the global context at COP26, and also the voices of communities around Wales and organisations aren't lost in the narrative as policy is put in place. So the people of Wales own the message. It's all sectors of society, so all demographics, all political parties, so long as they're willing to align with the basic principle that I just went through now, and people from all over communities in Wales, and those that identify strongly as Welsh, but also people who are, living in Wales, are sort of more broadly just the people of Wales. So, and we are, like I mentioned just now, productively engaging in the democratic process, a very active engagement there to make sure the leaders are listening. And it is quickly turning into quite a powerful network of Welsh organisations. We've got coming to 160 different organisations now, and that represents people from all sectors of society. So broad representation in civil society or Welsh businesses, social enterprises, a number of the leading universities in Wales, schools, community groups, institutions. We really have a collective. We're trying to get all of these different organizations and voices behind a central sort of rallying behind a kind of Wales focused campaign. And it's really been amazing to see the engagement actually of all of these organizations. And that organization sort of network has a real exciting potential to influence change with a more united voice and a more kind of aligned and well-informed through the network. So I promised you I would get to COP26. I just wanted to give a bit of a background of what we're trying to do. But COP26 this year in November, it's the official name is what I just put on the screen there, the 26th conference of the 26th Conference of Parties for the UN Convention on Climate Change, and it's a proper mouthful. So everyone just calls it COP26, and it is hard to overstate quite how important this event is, and definitely the event of the year. And it's we have this 10 years that the scientists made it very clear, and we're a year and a half into that, and this maps out for the world a plan on how to act on the climate and nature emergencies for the next 5 years. And so this is a real pivotal moment. And so forget the Olympics, forget Euro 2020, I guess it was called. Even if Wales got to the final, this would have been the most important event of the year. And we really need to mobilize around it. And so what's happening, there is a lot of very targeted and smart advocacy going on and negotiations to try and really step up globally what's happening. But leaders around the world are actually a bit hesitant to be bold because they're concerned about the collective attitude towards this. They need to see, in order that the door is open for them to act and not harm their political careers by acting, they need to believe and understand and see that the people of Wales, in a national sense, or the people of the world will support bold action. And that's where this sort of mobilization, knocking on the doors of these leaders really has an important role. And that's what we're sort of trying to facilitate with this hundreds of organizations and thousands of people around Wales. And we're tying into a lot of movements around the world that are trying to do the same. So building up to that, there is the Great Big Green Week, which is already got thousands of events registered around the UK. We're sort of the Wales focused partner on that to try and make that happen. And it's very entry level, lots of different styles of events, but there's hundreds of happening around Wales. So there might be something close to you, or there might also be, there is a call out for people to get involved if you're interested. And then beyond COP26, we really hope to speed up the transition to net zero in Wales and also make sure the work really gets going. Once we've got an agreement in place, the work really gets going to make that happen. And it's, you know, the separation between like talking big and having an agreement that is ambitious and then actually getting the work done. And so there is a real important role for a Welsh coalition there. And we want to make sure that the transition considers the people and organisations in Wales and doesn't get forgotten as policies are made either in the Senedd or in Westminster. We want to make sure that the people of Wales are not forgotten in that process. So just to tie it in and wrap up then on all of that. So making Wales a world leader, I suppose, is a real something that I think I care very much about. And I suppose as a small nation, climate change doesn't have any borders, right? So we could be perfect and really get everything in line in Wales. But if we don't also play our part in sort of speeding up the transition globally, then it will help, but not to the extent that we could. So we have to consider then where not only being a leader and stepping forwards and really demonstrating, and Wales in a number of ways is already leading. It has a lot of work to do, but also how do we inspire the rest of the UK and the rest of the world to move powerfully? And I think I just wanted to finish on an anecdote from a very small nation, Pacific Island leader in Paris 2015, which was the last time we had a major COP like this, and the first time a solid agreement was made. All of the big nations we're talking very realistically and trying to negotiate to cap everything at 2 degrees of warming. And 2 degrees of warming would mean the Pacific Islands would all be flooded and lost. And a very inspirational set of leaders from the Pacific Islands, very tiny emissions and tiny representation in terms of global population, actually changed the entire narrative. And through human sort of engagement and powerful leadership, they actually changed the narrative to include what we are now focused on now, which is keeping 1.5 degrees alive. And so 1.5 degrees as a target has very much changed the narrative of this entire last 5 years, and is very much a lead and a key focus of civil society and societies in general. So small nations can have a big impact. I'd like to see Climate Cymru really sort of making Wales a world leader in climate and nature emergencies. And it's better for the societies that are here. It's not a sacrifice on the part of the collective good. A climate-friendly society is a better one for Welsh communities. So just as a last invite to add your voice, get involved. We welcome organizations, even Yestival and possibly the movement itself possibly should get involved as a movement, and ambassadors or events. And diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over and open it up, and I will stay on and answer as many questions and get involved. And I'm excited to hear the other panelists' voices and opinions and presentations. Thanks so much.
Great, Tom. Brilliant. Thanks again. Encouraging to hear that the network's flourishing, strength in numbers, as you say. I'd like to move on. I'm not sure if I should introduce all the panel first, actually, having thought about it. So I'm going to do that. So Katie, Gallogly, Swan, if you just would like to say a couple of words about yourself, and I'll go around the table, the virtual table.
No worries, thanks, Cian. So my name is Katie Gallogly, Swan. In my day job, I work in a project with the UN Conference on Trade and Development and the Global Development Policy Centre on the global transition for the world economy, so focused on global economic governance. But I am also a long-time supporter of Scottish independence and have been involved in a part of the Scottish independence movement for quite a few years. Cheers, Cian.
Thanks. Rajsri?
Hi, my name's Rajsri, and I'm just a new member of the Youth Climate Consultation Group and a student from Cardiff, Wales, and just prepared a small presentation on what the YCA is and how we'd like Wales to help.
Thanks, Rajsri. Warm welcome. And Donal and then Duncan.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Donal. By day, I'm a sound engineer. That's my job. I'm here. The qualification for me being here as an environmental activist. I campaigned for 4 years with local groups and with Frack Free Wales when the UK government was all out for fracking and the oil companies putting in planning applications and threatening to rip through Wales and drill loads of holes. So we managed to stop that. So I'm here to share some of the insights that I learned from that process.
Brilliant. Diolch, Donal. And Duncan. Who's on mute? Who's still on mute?
Not anymore. So I'm Duncan. You missed the best bit there. Yeah. I'm Duncan. I live in the Brecon Beacons, and I manage a project here to change the food and agriculture system. So I will present that in relation to climate change a bit later. Thanks, Cian.
No worries. Well, thanks for that. That's like the formal bit, if you like, out the way. Thank goodness. So, Katie, could you maybe elaborate more on your work? And have you got a screen share option as well, I believe? Okay, thank you.
I will do. Cheers, Cian. So I suppose I'm going to do a wee presentation focusing on the relationship, I suppose, at its core between climate justice and economic justice. Keeping warming below 1.5 will require a massive industrial transformation on a global scale, which will change many aspects of our lives. And I suppose I'm interested in who pays the price of this transformation, whether it's in the UK or whether that's globally. So I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, can I get some screen sharing capabilities?
Any minute now.
No worries.
I don't believe I have the power though. Those hardworking people in the background do.
Thank you to the hardworking people.
Or do I? No? Anyone? It should be on all panelists.
Oh, there we go. That's it. Got it. Cheers. Now, maybe Cian, you can give me a heads up if you can see my screen.
Yes, I can.
Fantastic.
Brilliant.
So I suppose one big message that I would want to communicate is that there's no such thing as a national solution to the climate crisis. And questions or provocations that I have for my own sort of thoughts about Scottish independence, but also for Welsh activists is, if Wales could direct its own foreign policy, what would that look like? How would it differ from the UK? And how might that help not just Wales, but the wider world to secure climate justice? And we know, I mean, I think that there's other panelists are probably going to talk a little bit more about how the current approach by the Westminster leadership is not taken as in a positive place. And I've given 2 examples here just because these are recent pieces of news. The road building scheme, which is of course really important for some of our rural communities. I don't want to dismiss that, but the big focus on electric vehicles rather than the sort of pro-poor public transport system that we need to connect every community. And then also thinking about care and the deep underinvestment of care in the UK. And that is an important climate consideration too, because care jobs are green jobs when we're thinking about the sort of economic transformation and building a more resilient economy into the future. But also when we think about that, those economic strategies in relationship to international economic relationships such as trade, we also see that we are not going down a positive path. You know, this idea that Rishi Sunak has of free ports, which are really about tax havens with lower standards, you know, entering people into the race to the bottom, which are likely to displace jobs around the UK, is one example. This is another example when we think more broadly to the architecture of trade and investment agreements. The UK and many other countries are part of the Energy Charter Treaty, which is basically an investment protection system for fossil fuel investors. And the UK has the highest liability of any country in the world under the Energy Charter Treaty, obviously a lot of that in the North Sea. But you know, the question has been posed a few times, can we afford it? Can we afford to leave? I think that another important question is, can we afford to stay? And then, of course, this last week, the continuing of oil and gas exploration that we just cannot do if we are serious about keeping warming below 1.5. And this also shows a lack of any vision in transitioning the workers in these industries into any sort of future renewable industry or other green jobs. So what does this mean when we catapult the UK context into global climate action, when we know that in the UK, the impacts are not shared evenly, and it's often working people who have to bear the biggest price of government inaction? When we look historically at historical emissions, there's a pretty clear indication that there's a few of the richest countries in the world who actually hold the biggest responsibility of historic emissions. And of course, this isn't about saying that, you know, that people in the poor people in these rich countries necessarily gained benefits from that. We know that it's the elites in these countries, but there are asymmetries between the rich and the poor. There are also asymmetries between the North and the South in the world economy. And this is maybe a more explicit indication of who has contributed most to global carbon emissions. The US alone has contributed about a quarter of the global historic emissions. And then when we put that and articulate that from the rich-poor divide, you know, the richest 10% are responsible for around about half of all emissions. So this is not just, like I said, about north-south, it's also about rich-poor. And this has massive implications too for who is the most impacted by climate change. The areas that are red are the places that are at the most risk of devastation as more climate disasters increase, and the places that are blue are the safest. So while the countries in red tend to be the ones that are the least responsible, they are the ones that will bear the biggest impacts. Now, none of this is supposed to sort of say that, you know, we should feel ashamed. It should galvanize us into asking why and how we challenge this. And this is a final graph just to show that, you know, the transition cost and loss and damage, which is the sort of negative impacts of destruction of climate disasters, you know, is well over $1 trillion every year. And the UK's ambitious sort of target that it's set for and not met for the last few years under the COP process, you know, the UK is advocating for this 100 billion figure. When we know this bottom one here, the Green Climate Fund, when we know that is nowhere near the scale of the need for the global transition. And this is shown in our sort of trajectories for keeping warming below 1.5 at the current policy trajectory, this orange one here. We are probably looking at 2.8 to 3.2, when, as Sam said, the existential future for a lot of places in the world depends on us keeping below 1.5. And now all of this, you know, again, like I say, this isn't about sort of making us feel depressed, but making us think, you know, what is the barrier to this action? And I would make the case that imperialism holds back the action we need to take, that the dominance of a few of the elites in these big countries prevents us from being able to take the action that we need. So I want to use a recent example for how this plays out. The pandemic has maybe been a bit of a test run. Climate change is happening now. It will continue to happen. It is across a time scale. The pandemic has happened in a very short space of time, but maybe gives us a bit of an indication of how ready we are to work collectively towards a common goal. And global vaccination is one really important example. So there is an initiative at the moment at the World Trade Organization to waive the patents for COVID vaccines so that we can rapidly increase production, because we're just simply not vaccinating people fast enough around the world. At the moment, there are only a handful of countries who are blocking this initiative, and the UK is one of them. You can see that big X there. This is an institution that, should any nations within the UK become independent, they would have their own seat within this institution, the World Trade Organization. Now, people around the world have been mobilizing for the past year to try and break these vaccine monopolies, allow the patents to be shared so that other countries can produce their own cheaper vaccines. And we can see this is played out by a concentration of vaccination in the north and relatively few vaccinations comparatively in the rest of the world, where a few countries have managed to corner the market, are blocking an initiative which would allow other countries to make their own vaccines. So this isn't about saying we need to share the pie better, it's about we need to make the pie bigger altogether. And I use this example because while it's not climate related, it gives us an indication of, you know, this will only come back to bite us if we don't vaccinate the world, because the vaccine, the virus anywhere can always come back, can always mutate, can always become resistant or more deadly. And climate's kind of similar. We can escape it, as Sam said, you know, this knows no borders, and yet we're still focused on an approach that benefits the few at the expense of the many. So I suppose thinking about what an independent approach from Wales could look like, I'd like to propose that it's not just about a more just and accountable domestic approach, but also thinking about how could that help redistribute power globally away from imperial centres such as the UK to stand in solidarity with the rest of the world and collaborate on collective solutions to make sure that action here doesn't come at the expense of people elsewhere. I'll stop there.
Amazing. Thanks, Katie. You know, it is hard not to get depressed. It's a long list of concerns, but I am encouraged by some of the work being done as well. On that note, Donal, you mentioned like Frack-Free Wales earlier, that, you know, a successful campaign by a small group of people, David and Goliath, if you like, scenario. So success is achievable, or gains or strides, or whatever label you want to put on it. So yeah, we must stay positive, and well, we haven't got a choice, so we have to carry on. So Donal, llongyfarchiadau a diolch am dy waith efo Frack-Free Wales.
It was but one small cog in a big movement.
Cog pwysig tybiwn ni. Os lici di cario ymlaen efo'r sgwrs ar hyn sy'n ti ddeud?
Yeah, I'm sure. So one of the main things I learned from the fracking campaign is that environmental campaigns can succeed. Small, focused, grassroots environmental campaigns can succeed. The other thing I learned is that the tide against us is massive. I'm also slightly concerned that with the focus on climate change is super important, we all know that. It's just one symptom of humanity living out of equilibrium with nature. Lots of other symptoms, there's a list here: biodiversity loss, species extinctions, resource depletion, both mineral and natural resources, pollution, plastic, all the plastic, pollution of the air, the land, the sea, deforestation is still rocketing ahead despite everything Sting did. Thanks, Sting, wasn't enough. Soil depletion as a result of industrial agriculture. I know Duncan's going to talk about agriculture. So my worry is, even if tomorrow we pressed a magic button and hit net zero, the whole world hit net zero, none of these other problems would stop. We'd need to address them all. So this sent me off on a search. Like the tide against us was, by the end of the campaign for fracking, like it's clear this is being driven by the obsession with GDP and with growing GDP, and the obsession of seeking profit seeking more profit. Profits have got to go up. So I dug deeper underneath that, and what's become clear to me that's driving it is that our entire monetary system is based on debt. This is not widely known. In fact, lawmakers don't know it. 4 years ago, there was a survey and they found out that 85% of British MPs do not know how money is created and how it's destroyed. And I can't imagine with the current crop of MPs, it's any different. So let me tell you, it's not banknotes backed by gold in the central bank vault. It used to be, it isn't anymore, hasn't been for over half a century. It's not, as in the that fantastic movie, It's a Wonderful Life. It's not a bank taking in deposits from savers and lending them out to borrowers. It used to be, it's not anymore. Money comes into existence when someone takes out a loan with a bank, a central bank or a commercial bank creates the money at that point and gives it to the borrower out of nothing. There are requirements for reserve. You've got maybe 10% reserves of money you lend out, but when a loan is being made, that decision to make the loan is based solely on the capacity of the borrower to pay it back. There's no, that's not someone else's money, it's just new money. Switch my notes. So we may all remember Theresa May patronizing that poor nurse on Question Time. Oh, my dear, there's no magic money tree that we can just, yes, there is. There is a magic money tree. Government, corporations and banks have access to it. We don't, the Welsh Government doesn't, plebs don't. That's why there's no money for nurses. There's never any money for universal credit. Sorry, that £20 is gone, but there's always money for war and there's always money for fossil fuel subsidies. So this debt-based money, I'm going to try and speed up to cover the ground. This debt-based money system causes three problems. The first one is environmental. So when we borrow money into existence to do stuff, to lend to companies, corporations, even people, definitely to governments, where in the past we would have saved up and spent that money. So that economic activity is brought forward from the future to today, and the environmental consequences, the externalities of that economic activity happens today instead of in 5 or 10 or however long it would have taken us to save the money to do the thing. So the pollution and the resource use happens now instead of in the future, and we can all see the result. The second effect is social. The first panel talked about this a lot. Debt-based money exacerbates the wealth gap. After the United States unilaterally took the world off the gold standard in the early 70s, and in the late 70s, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan promised us, when they deregulated the banking sector, that we'd all get trickle-down economics, that the rising tide will lift all boats. Well, this 50 years later, the evidence is in, it wasn't true. It isn't true. Wealth inequality, look, any graphs, look up wealth inequality graphs. Wealth inequality has risen steadily since the 1970s. It then accelerated from 2008 onwards when quantitative easing came in, and governments and central banks started bailing out the banks that had magicked up too much money and given it to people who couldn't pay them back. And 18 months ago, the last 18 months, wealth inequality has absolutely rocketed as since quantitative easing has accelerated as part of the pandemic response. And the third problem is economic. So I think it's over 90% of the money in existence is in the form of these IOUs to a bank. So all the money, the vast majority of the money out there carries with it an obligation to be paid back with interest, which means all the money has to generate more money. And where does that come from? And that loops us back round to GDP and profit. What's driving the obsession with GDP going up and profit going up is that if it doesn't, the entire system will collapse because we can't pay back that money. So basically, humanity is on an economic treadmill where we've just got to keep going faster and faster just to stay still. And the results of this is to any environmentalist, anybody who's paying attention, is clear for everybody to see. So I don't have I've got some, the good news of all of this is good news in the long term, and it's terrible news in the medium term. The good news in the long term is that this system is fundamentally unsustainable and it will end. There is no way for us all to pay back all this debt. It's not possible, not us, our children, our grandchildren. It's just not possible. I mean, debt is increasing exponentially. The bad news of that exact same thing is in the medium term, it's highly likely that there will be a collapse, whether it's a crash or whether we can engineer a soft landing. That's up to us as individuals, as communities, as hopefully small independent nations, to change that and put a different system in place. I'll try and wrap it up. The opposite of debt money is savings money. For most of human history, we've worked, we've saved up stuff, and then when we've got some savings, we've done cool stuff with it. So from shells to rhinestones to precious metals, coins, up until the middle of the last century, that's how humanity is run. And we've kind of figured out how to do it sustainably. So how do we use savings money? Again, individuals, communities, and nations. Personally, I've started saving in Bitcoin. I know this is controversial because I saw some of the comments on Twitter below Yes Cymru announcements. Short term, Bitcoin is a nightmare for savings. Medium term, Bitcoin has never been lower than it was 4 years ago. So nobody has ever held Bitcoin for 4 years and lost money. So medium to long term, we need to think medium to long term as a species. It starts individually. I don't know the answer at community and national level. There are more eloquent and more knowledgeable people than me on these panels. My instinct as an environmentalist and my suggestion to us is that when we get independent, that we set up a Welsh economy based on savings money and not on debt money, else we'll just career down the same bad path. That's my piece. Thanks.
Diolch, Donal. Mae'n amlwg i fi, dwi'n meddwl, pa mor, dwi'n meddwl beth yw'r gair Cymraeg am interconnected, ond mae'n amlwg o'r sgwrsiau da ni'n cael heddiw a'r sgwrsiau o Yestival gyntaf, pa mor interconnected di'r pwnc yma gyd. A falch bod chdi codi'r pwynt o debt hefyd. Factor pwysig. Rajsri, I'd like to come to you next, if I may. Really happy we have you joining us. I'll let you explain further. Okay, thank you very much.
So I'm here on behalf of the YCA, and I've just prepared a short presentation on what we're about, what we've done so far, and what we really like of the Welsh Government. So I'll just present my screen now. Okay, so I'm just trying to present my screen. So the YCA for Wales are a group of young people working to contribute to the fight against climate change. The main objectives of the network include amplifying young people's voices to ensure that our concerns and views are heard, with the potential long-term effects of climate change having the biggest impact on the younger generation. This need to ensure that we are heard becomes more important and more relevant than ever. The group also seeks to raise awareness for the climate crisis across Wales and use a wide range of platforms available to us to educate people on how they themselves can take climate action. YCA Wales also wishes to make businesses in Wales greener and more responsible for their effect on the environment, such as by cutting greenhouse gas emissions and plastic waste. I've only recently had the privilege of joining the network, but I can say that the group has already done some remarkable work over the course of this year. The ambassadors have taken actions to begin fulfilling the objectives of the network, such as by using different ways to spread the message about the climate crisis and educate as many people as possible. The group has reached different organisations to share the importance of taking climate action, such as through our ambassadors speaking with a representative from the US Embassy, as well as with BBC on this topic. We've also formed partnerships with different organisations, such as Climate Cymru, which will only help us to reach more people and really make a difference. Our ambassadors have also helped support different campaigns, including Go Green Day 2021, which was held on the 25th of June, which was a day organised by the Size of Wales, dedicated to supporting tropical rainforests and raising awareness against deforestation. Furthermore, the chairs of the group have spoken at a wide range of events, such as those held by Fairtrade Wales and Climate Case Ireland. Our ambassadors have also collaborated with organisations such as the Size of Wales and WWF Cymru on a workshop and a panel to address young people's concerns on the climate crisis. Our chairs have also had the opportunity to present the views of the network in a discussion organised by the Foreign Office, where very important topics were addressed, expanding on the climate crisis into topics as well as mental health and human rights. Additionally, YCA Wales have taken full advantage of the social media platforms available to them, like Instagram and Twitter, to educate young people on different topics, such as the topic of voting, following the recent bill lowering the voting age in Wales to 16. This was also done by ambassadors organising an event on voting and climate change, covering the significance of voting, how to register, and the different parties' views on climate change. Two of our ambassadors helped co-host an online hosting with We All Alliance ahead of the Senate election, where important questions to the politicians were asked on behalf of young people in Wales. Personally, I found the way that YCA helped share information on the topic of voting really important and really admirable, because at this moment in time especially, there is a present problem with young people across the world having very limited knowledge on voting and who to vote for, which political parties to support, and as a result, this leads to many young people voting of very little information, and this, or not voting at all, which can lead essentially to their vote being wasted. So this move by the YCA was really significant in amplifying the younger generation's voice in Wales. There are ways that we'd really like Wales and the Welsh Government to help in order to make a difference and help protect our planet. These ways include putting different actions in place to make businesses in Wales reduce their ecological footprint, for instance, by setting clear carbon caps on all businesses. We'd also like the government to take into account and tackle the emissions associated with the import and transportation of foreign goods into the country. And finally, in regards to CO2 emissions and waste, the government can also really help by banning single-use plastics, such as those found in packaging and masks. Other ways in which we really need the Welsh Government's help is to make public transport accessible and affordable to all parts of Wales, to aid in cutting down on emissions associated with vehicles. The government can also help by encouraging schools to recycle items, such as by making it compulsory, and to reduce food waste. And finally, we really want the Welsh Government to produce a plan to tackle deforestation in Wales, such as by setting targets for reforestation to reach by 2025. So essentially, to sum up and to conclude, the primary aims of YCA Wales include educating as many people across the country as we can on the crisis, and to ensure that young people's voices are amplified and their concerns are listened to. Measures and plans need to be established by the Welsh Government regarding issues such as deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions to make a change and a move towards a greener and more eco-friendly Wales. Thank you. Yes.
Brilliant. Diolch, Rajsri. I'd like to echo Sam's comments there and congratulate the work that the YCA are doing. And if, like Sam saying, if anyone's feeling bleak out about all this, follow this amazing crew. And you'll still be a whole lot more hopeful about what we can do when we get active and mobilise. Very good and encouraging words indeed. Another good feel-good factor story, I think, is coming our way from Duncan and his work. Duncan, who's on mute.
Thanks, Cian. I'm going to do the bad news first, I think. So be prepared to be very depressed for a little while at least. So I'm going to talk about a specific issue, which is climate change in relation to food and agriculture in Wales. But it's just as much an issue about development and rural poverty and housing. So I'll touch on all of them. So what is the problem with food, agriculture and climate change in Wales? And the answer, in my view, is it's the food system. It's what happens between the farm and the fork. And the problem is not, as commonly understood, farmers. Farmers are being ripped off, they're being squeezed horribly, and then they do have to take a lot of the blame. They get a lot of the blame. So let's have a look. The profit in the food is the profit from farming and food is in the food chain. That's between the farm and the fork. And the problem is that that food chain has been torn out of our communities and to a large extent out of Wales as a whole. So in my region, Brecon Beacons and Monmouthshire, that's where I live and work, nearly all the food that is grown here is carted out. And nearly all the food that we buy here and eat here is carted in. There is local food, it's fantastic, but it's niche. The Welsh Government buys food for its services, public services. 90% of that food is grown outside of Wales. So what happens when farmers are paid, and the result of this is that farmers are paid a very low price because there isn't profit, particularly in growing things. So what happens when farmers are paid these low prices year after year after year? The prices farms get are so low that a government subsidy system is needed to keep them afloat. And the future of that subsidy system is now in doubt. There's pressure to extract nutrients from fields faster than they can be replaced. So you need petrochemical-based fertilizers. There's pressure to remove natural obstacles fast by killing them with chemicals, fungicides, pesticides, and herbicides. They're all poisons and they end up everywhere, including in us. And all this together depletes soil. Healthy soil, if you've ever held it, is dark, it's moist, it's seething with wildlife. Assaulting it for quick wins turns it into mud. And in floods, mud gets washed away. And in Crickhowell, it gets washed into our living rooms. And I'm going to share a picture. What? Can you see that? Can people see that? So that is just upriver from Crickhowell, where I live. It's 2.5 meters deep and it's 200 meters long and it's by the river. That happened one night a year ago when a flood went over a field that looked like that. So that's what happens when you put water, a lot of water, over a mud field as opposed to a field full of healthy soil. Come back to me. So all of this and the transport of food in and out of everywhere creates carbon dioxide. Agrochemicals, machinery, transport, food processing, refrigeration, ploughing. And ploughing releases carbon. I'll come back to that. It releases a lot of carbon. It also, the system produces nitrous oxides while making fertilizers and while spreading them on the land. Food and agriculture account for 12% of Welsh greenhouse gas emissions. And that's to say nothing of the pressure on biodiversity. So in my region, we can measure that by looking at bird life, which is a very good and accurate indicator of nature's health. So in the Brecon Beacons, many bird species have declined by over 50% since the 1970s. Swifts, greenfinch, yellowhammer. So they're indicators, they're saying we're declining steadily. Another big pressure of this system on farms is that they need to reduce the number of people working on farms. They need to replace people with machines and with chemicals as fewer and fewer people try to farm larger and larger pieces of land. And that combines with a rural housing crisis. Rural areas are being overwhelmed at the moment, as we all know from the news, by holiday homes, second homes, and now, since COVID, commuter homes. House prices in Wales have increased 16% in the last year, compared with 9% across the UK as a whole. That's the fastest rise in house prices anywhere in the UK. And a rural youth report this year found that 60% of the people, young people living in Paris, are now thinking of leaving. Effectively, if that happens, our rural areas are simply dying. I guess some of you might be thinking at this moment about, well, what about the need for cheap food? Because we've been talking about poverty. The thing that is, there is no such thing as cheap food. There is only food that can be sold at less than the cost by people who are powerful enough to do it. So we pay for food in 4 ways. We pay at the till. We pay for the environmental mess through our taxes and our water bills. We pay for the farm subsidies in our taxes. And we pay for the health system that treats the epidemic of diet-related illness. And it's been calculated for every pound that we pay at the till, there is another pound to pay. So the answer to rampant food poverty is not ripping off farmers and communities even more. It is simply, as was said this morning, making sure people have enough money to pay for food and not be hungry. And the other myth about cheap food is one that the corporations have cultivated over years. Only big agriculture can produce it. That's rubbish. Small farms can be extraordinarily productive. Take horticulture. Numerous international experiments have shown that you can make a net income of £40,000 on 2 acres managed by 2 people, and that feeds over 100 families a year. Those figures, if you're in the field, sound ridiculously high, but that's only because we've been sold a lie for decades. So that's the bad news. Now I'm going to go on some good news about what we can do and ask the question about the independence right at the end. I'm not going to try and answer that question, by the way. I'm going to pitch it out. So what do we need to do? Well, first, at the national level, we have to have a government that can effectively regulate the corporate supply chains. We just have to rein them in so that they do their job without extracting our well-being. And secondly, at the more regional, local level, we need to take action to tackle the mess. And we're doing this in the Brecon Beacons and Monmouthshire through the project that I'm managing, Our Food. And we're building 3 system changes to address this multiplicity of problems. First, farmers must own the supply chain. They must own the supply chain all the way from the farm to the fork. They can't afford to share the profit of the food chain with anyone. So that means shorter supply chains, local, regional, national, and it means collaboration. Retail outlets and processing facilities can be run by farmer-owned companies. And there are brilliant examples of this all over the world. The second principle is we need to start thinking about small farming enterprise as opposed to farming as landowning. A family can make a living on 5 acres. We need hundreds and thousands of families doing this all over our country. So we need a system of land rental, a bit like renting an office in a city. And if we do that, we need to fix the housing for a whole new generation of rural entrepreneurs. And thirdly, lastly, we need to introduce regenerative farming. And that is farming that focuses on rebuilding the soil health. And that fixes carbon, it grows more healthy food, and it reduces flooding massively. An interesting statistic in our water catchment area is that the amount of rain it takes to cause a flood has decreased by 40% since the Second World War. At the same time, now we're getting increased rain. So when there's a flood, it's not just because there's a huge amount of rain, which there will be, but also because the land just isn't holding it. So regenerative farming is about minimizing ploughing or not ploughing at all, as in no-till techniques, not using chemicals, minimal use of heavy machinery which crushes and squeezes the soil, year-round green cover, never have any brown fields, especially in the flood seasons now, and animals integrated into the farm ecosystem. So pigs are excellent for preparing ground for no-till farming. Ducks eat the slugs, so the slugs don't eat the lettuce. Chickens, if you put them in a house on wheels and wheel them around on a field, will fertilize the whole field for you for nothing. So is this pie in the sky? I want you to look at this picture. I'm going to do this again. Is that clear? Okay, so that is farming cacao. On the left is what it looked like in April 2020, just as COVID was hitting us. And the picture on the right is the same field in, well, a couple of weeks ago. This was built in Crickhowell by 2 young people in their 20s. They're not rich. They're not from a farming background. They actually learned everything online. They rented the land from the landowner. They got no support from government, no subsidies, no capital grants. And the reason for that is because as far as government is concerned, they are too small and not a real farm. That's less than 12 acres by Welsh Government standards. They serve 60 families year round, and that will double by next year. And they use regenerative techniques throughout. So what we're doing here is we're going to try to mainstream this system change in our region. We're looking at 1,200 acres of this kind of food. And we are getting good support from Monmouthshire County Council, the National Park Authority, and actually Welsh Government have been looking at it very carefully and seem to be very supportive. So really my question for today, and I'm really interested in the answer and I don't actually know it, is can we achieve what we need to achieve nationally and regionally if we are beholden to Westminster and the policies that it's pursuing in relation to food and agriculture and drawing us into that process? Thanks, Cian.
Brilliant. I hope you don't expect me to answer that question.
No.
Because I haven't got enough time. But as I think I mentioned earlier, or someone did, this is the start of a process. we're not looking to get all the answers in a day. It's impossible, but we have to start, and hopefully this will be a fruitful beginning. We are nearing the end of the discussion, so thanks to everyone, all the guests, our guests. If anyone at home has any specific questions, as I said, please use the Q&A option. Mark will be joining us again in a bit to help summarise what we've heard. Suppose another question, maybe Mark can address Duncan's question even, or attempt, or a better attempt than I could. But another one would be the planet. Obviously, we can't afford to wait for governments to get their act together. Hence, we're in this hole already. But could Wales become a world leader if it was free to do so? So I might throw those two questions to the panelists just quickly, if anyone would care to respond.
Sure, I can just jump in just to get the ball rolling. Yeah. I mean, yes, Wales could be a world leader, and the question of whether what is it that's stopping it doing so? And I think I sort of referenced already, but there is this sort of sentiment globally and in Wales that political leaders are doing what will often do what is best for their own career, whether that's a cynical thing or not. But if you can align what's best for their career with what's best for the people and the planet, then you're really onto a winner. But at the moment, often what they're settling on is talking big on climate and nature, but not necessarily delivering big, because delivering big can be disruptive as well. It has some repercussions of, like, it is disruptive to make big, bold changes. So it's easy to talk, just kind of pacify some people and make some big, impressive speeches. So what we're looking for is to bridge that gap. And now, in order to do that, in order to shift that sort of framing for the politician of, like, okay, we need to act, we need to make them understand and believe that that's what we're demanding and need us to do. So that's true within Wales and a global thing. So I don't know, that's just something like a framing from where the leaders are sitting and what we need to do to collectively make them understand. If they're getting their inboxes filled every day with people who care about climate and nature, if they're getting questions about it, if they're getting people out in the streets, if they need to see that. And I think so we have a part to play in this democratic process. We're not powerless. And we have to participate.
Thanks, Sam. Katie, how can the Welsh indie movement be a leading light for other countries in tackling climate change? This is a question came through to you.
Thank you. And I'll also, this I suppose is an interesting, the idea of being a world leader, I think that can be a positive concept, as in, someone who wants to share knowledge and be collaborative. And there's also, some of that maybe we've inherited too from the UK government, who's always saying we are world leaders in X, Y, and Z when they rarely are. But I suppose, like, I've learned loads on this panel today, hearing from folks, because as you can probably tell, I'm not Welsh myself. But there are similar problems in other parts of the world, and I suppose one of the things that has been mentioned is the importance of small countries working together, particularly in an environment where these issues are interconnected and interdependent. We can't separate the food security issues in Wales from food security issues elsewhere in the world, and that means not blaming farmers in Malawi who are importing their food into Wales, but recognising that that's partly to do with an architecture of trade rules which locks those countries into agricultural exporting, devalues the price of food here, and means that our own food security and resilience is depleted. And these rules are not neutral. They are not, this international law is not neutral. It's not sort of set in stone. This is something that we have the power to put pressure on our leaders and change it, but it's completely within, it's just not going to be on the agenda of the UK anytime soon to challenge this, because these are not issues that it's ideologically opposed to their neoliberal understanding of the world. And so I think that, you know, leadership in collaboration and in partnership with other small nations, I think would be an incredible step forward for countries coming out of you know, an imperial centre like the UK, you know, collaborating and learning with these countries who are dependent on agricultural exports for their economic sustenance. You know, that's the sort of collaboration between small states we need to overcome the immense power at the global level in these global economic governance institutions, which holds these sorts of initiatives back.
I'll add to that. I mean, there is already an alliance of small nations that we're part of with Scotland in the Wellbeing Governmental Partnership, and there are 5 governments have got together, and we're hopefully doing a session with young people at COP26. So that's New Zealand, Finland, Iceland, Wales, and Scotland. And they do reject this idea of leadership, because it's a very masculine kind of sort of thrusting concept, really, when that isn't what's going to solve this problem. What's going to solve this problem is collaboration, and they very much adopt that tone. But I guess what my fear is that I can't see in that partnership. So it brings it out. You know, 3 of those governments are independent. They've got central banks. They can do things, right? They can do things but Scotland and Wales can't. And now Scotland, I believe that everyone in Scotland is sort of banking on the fact that you're going to be independent at some time soon. And that's kind of there's a baseline assumption that's kind of going to happen. So let's just pretend it has happened, and let's just get on with international relations on that basis. But in Wales, I'm just looking at the powers of the Welsh Government and thinking they're just receding. And we're getting sucked down and away from this. And at some point, we're going to have to be invited to leave this partnership on the grounds that we have absolutely no powers to do anything. So I'm worried, actually, about that. And I look at Cardiff and I look at Westminster, and that they're just, on climate change, totally different, completely diametrically opposed. I can't see the way through, say. And that includes in my field of agriculture and food. They are diametrically opposed to each other in their policies.
I'm going to move on to the Q&A. We've got a couple of questions to get through here. One for Donal. How is Bitcoin either socially useful or environmentally friendly? From a skeptic, Cardi. Diolch.
Very quickly, energy use. Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. That's no secret. It uses, the numbers I was looking up this week, it uses 0.3% of the world's electricity, and it generates approximately 0.1% of carbon emissions associated with electricity generation. So the people like to compare it to countries, it's small relative. Another point, the emissions are falling. The trend, the incentives of the system is driving Bitcoin miners to seek cheaper and cheaper electricity. And ultimately, that's going to be just stranded electricity, surplus electricity, and non-rival electricity. So energy that we can't use as a society usefully. I think in 5 or 10 years, it'll be completely off the regular electrical grids because you won't be able to afford to pay for electricity to mine Bitcoin. That aside, it does bring up the question of the value judgment. So what is the value of a non-sovereign, permissionless, open monetary network? Who's using now? Human rights activists are using Bitcoin right now to carry on campaigning against authoritarian governments. Look up the Human Rights Foundation. They're very involved in Bitcoin and helping to develop it for this very purpose. Citizens in collapsing economies like Venezuela, like Nigeria, like Lebanon, are using Bitcoin today to escape their savings just evaporating in front of their very eyes. El Salvador is in the process of making Bitcoin legal tender because 70% of its population cannot get a bank account. So given those, what is the value, what value and what electricity and emissions is valid for uses like that? Some silly comparisons, the emissions are less. Bitcoin's emissions is less than cruise ships, it's less than clothes dryers in America, just America, it's less than Christmas lights, just in America, it's less than Elon Musk's SpaceX project. So they're the silly comparisons. The sensible comparisons. True world reserve currency, historically gold was the world reserve currency. Gold mining is horrible for the environment. You've got in informal mines in Africa, you've got young African men who get high in order to even go down the hole, and the hole collapses on them and they die. In the Amazon rainforest, you've got industrial scale gold mining, which is just all the spillover is pouring down the valleys and just polluting vast tracts of the Amazon, all for the gold to be made into ingots and stored in a central bank vault where it doesn't even back up our national currencies anymore. The current world reserve currency is the US dollar, also known as the petrodollar. The petrodollar is based on a horrible dysfunctional relationship between the US and oil producing states, where they promise to sell their oil for dollars. The oil producing states then buy US bonds, lend that money back to America in return for the American military protecting them. The American military is one of the biggest polluters in the world, as well as all the nasty, horrible other stuff it's done. And for me, just to wrap up, it gives me hope because it offers us an exit from the treadmill of ever-increasing debt and environmental destruction. That's why I think environmental cost is absolutely worth it.
Donal. Rajsri, question for yourself. How do younger people feel about independence as a potential solution to the climate crisis?
Well, the YC itself is a non-political organisation, so it doesn't lead back any political parties. But I do think that the general, thought for climate change by young people is that we really just need to work together, whether that is with the whole UK or with other countries. We really just need to unite. And there is a possibility that if we do keep going for Welsh independence, there will be a split. So I think the most important thing is that we really work together and unite with other countries to solve this problem and to try and recover and try to, solve this problem. And just really approach the problem with other countries and just avoid sort of splitting and unifying against a common cause.
Indeed. I'm going to ask now, I think we have a couple of polls planned. So if the powers that be can accommodate me, we'll look to have these polls up soon. I think I'm trying to think if there's other questions we can even attempt to address today, to be honest.
While you're working on it, Cian, I've seen an important point come up in the chat, so I'll give you a minute and I'll address that if you like. Yeah. So Mike Lewis has mentioned a point about global migration, and it is a very important issue, and we haven't talked about it much. And this is one of the important reasons why we need to act meaningfully on climate. There's this climate injustice that Katie laid out very beautifully. There's also climate injustice with generations, in the sense of like older generations have done more versus the younger generations that's represented by the YCA today. And there is this big climate injustice, if you like, of this the mass migration that will be instigated by sort of runaway climate change. And so we really have a choice, and I suppose it is an important issue and something that often doesn't get thought about when you're thinking about, okay, well, there's going to be worse floodings, or there's going to be bigger hurricanes, or whatever, wildfires. But the way that people have to live and exist and move, and there is tough choices for developed countries, how open to have your borders, and there's definitely going to be always that sort of immigration is a hot topic, and something that needs to be politically navigated, and navigated in a human way. Like, we're just human beings, and we can label ourselves in different ways, but ultimately we were just born somewhere, and we're humans trying to get on with our lives and live a happy life. So it needs to be respected. It's a powerful motivator for me on acting meaningfully on climate. And so thanks for raising that issue that we didn't touch on.
Thanks, Sam. I've got a question here from Mandy for you, Duncan. Very interesting slot on agriculture, horticulture. Sorry, I missed the beginning. Where can I read more about your work, Duncan? We are big supporters of our local market gardener.
Oh, shall I just put it? I'll put a website in the chat. Yeah. Yeah,
I think you did mention earlier. But yeah,
that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. Are we ready for our polls yet? Oh, I've got another one. Abbas, the news today mentioned that there are some shelves in the supermarket in Wales that are empty. Is this the reason that there are enough drivers to transport the products, or are there other reasons? Before and after independence, do you think Wales can challenge like this problems relying on the workforce and its products? That's a question in the Q&A. I'm not aware of this. We'll come back to, if any other questions that haven't been answered, please keep them coming in. We have all day to get through them later anyway, but I'm mindful of the time, and I would like to get these polls out.
Have I got time, or should we go ahead?
We'll leave that there.
Oh, I was just going to say quickly that obviously the UK Home Office has an inhumane immigration policy. They are currently paying for France to now patrol the waters in order to prevent migrants from reaching the UK. And I think that it's really important that we do not divide the ambitions for climate justice, for anti-racism, for economic justice, and recognise that a lot of the mainstream environmentalist arguments for climate are actually deeply racist and anti-feminist. As an example, the sort of Malthusian, David Attenborough supported stuff around population control, is deeply inaccurate. If you compare the emissions from someone in Ethiopia, as an example, to someone in the UK, Ethiopia is 1/65th of a British person's emissions, and that's just an average British person. The richer you are, the more emissions you're going to be making, but 1/65th. So I think that we really need to, in advancing a sort of climate justice vision, recognise that we cannot separate these issues of racist borders or racist environmental fixes of let's fund family planning for women in poor countries so that they don't have more babies. That is not the problem. The problem is the fossil fuel giants. The problem is a global elite who do not care that many in the world are considered disposable. And I think that it's really, really important that we tackle that head on in our climate activism.
Thanks, Kay. Sobering words and important points made all afternoon. My head is swimming, if you haven't noticed, trying to digest it all. I think there is a poll in progress, is it, I believe? If anyone can't see it, I'm presuming it's there for all to see. So I'm not familiar with this format. Does this poll close? Who ends the poll? Me? Do I wield the power, do I? Who knows? I'll let that one sit there for you. I think we're close to coming to an end, and I believe we have got another poll. I'm going to check if there is a second poll. Well, they'll tell me shortly. Sam's got his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. So great question from Josh Nesfield in the Q&A. And so how do we balance a push for food sovereignty, which will require rewiring large parts of Wales as agricultural sector and land use towards arable, and respect for traditional Welsh rural communities and livestock farming? Really important question, and there's a lot to dive into there. But I think firstly, it's necessary to address a kind of a misconception about what farming looks like in a sort of regenerative farming actually looks like. It's not a sort of replacing the Welsh sort of livestock with big fields of necessary sort of arable kind of farming. It is, you know, in a sort of food future world, and Duncan can talk more eloquently about this, but there is a lot of sort of agroforestry involved. There's a lot of, there is actually a place for livestock within a regenerative farm, but it done in a different way, you know, lots more rotation, lots more sort of integration with the different sort of food groups, and so it does require change, which is going to be hard. And also there is a need in a climate transition for areas of rewilding, and that is a tense point, and that comes up a lot with the discussion in rural communities. Now, what we need to look is the areas that are the least productive and really struggling. Those areas are the sort of areas maybe we can look at for some, you know, and it needs to be done in a fair way. And this is what Climate Cymru is really important. And we need to engage, the farmers need to have their say, and the rural communities need to be heard before these grand plans for rewilding are made. You know, it has to consider those sectors. So partly it's not a case of just replacing the sheep and cattle with other things. And there's something to acknowledge also that Wales is one of the leaders in livestock, in the sense of most, you know, almost all of the Wales is grass-fed. It's not industrial agriculture, sort of, you know, for the most part. So there is examples in Wales, but there is still something to look at, which is like the sheer amount of pounds of food that are made on an acre can be improved and refined with what we're currently at. So it's a case of like working with communities, and it's complex, and let's have that discussion. And so that's something we're looking at very deeply with Climate Cymru. Thanks for raising.
I can add to that and say, I think that what would happen in the model that I was presenting in terms of landscape was it would become much more of a patchwork, a lot more smaller operations all over the place, some big fields, some big things, but lots more smaller ones, because small is actually more productive. It's not the other way around. Much more diversity, much more trading between farmers. So, you know, if you're supplying your customers with vegetables, for example, other farmers will supply you with stuff, supplementary stuff and things like that. That's what would happen, I think. And there was an interesting picture. The National Park Authority in Brecon Beacons commissioned a picture of what the landscape would look like in this system. And it was full of polytunnels, trees, more hedgerows, trees with animals and trees in them, I mean, fields with animals and trees in them together, lots more mixed, all mixed up.
Perhaps we can plant a Yes Cymru nut forest, Duncan. Shall we sow the seed? Excuse the pun. Mark, can you hear me? Come on down. What's your name? Where do you come from?
Mark from Barry.
There you go. I just want to say thanks a very diolch o galon, as we say, yn iaith y nefoedd. Diolch o galon I pawb am uno a I chi adra am wrando. Dwi'n mynd I roi chi wan yn gofal Mark I wneud lot mwy o sens o beth da ni wedi clywed. Na fyswn ni'n byth yn gallu wneud. Okay. Diolch o galon pawb. Much respect. Thank you very much.
Diolch, Cian. I think it's actually really difficult to sum up that conversation into it, because I can't think of anything that was said that wasn't important. It was, there were no, often you get conversations and you think, 35 minutes of it, you can just go blur, but there was no blur. These things are really important. And I think the stuff that was touched on were big things. We were talking about the fact that, and I don't know whether Sam is actually, talking about had Wales got to the Euro final, it would have been less important than COP26. I think was a good place to start, but I'd be on your toes quite quickly on that one. But I think, clearly we're at an important juncture. One point that Katie made in the middle, she talked about if we carry on this trajectory we're on, we're talking about 2.8 to 3.2 degrees above the warming that is the old warming. So that's massively overreaching that target. So we're in deep trouble and need urgent action. And the thing that I found fascinating then, especially when Donal was talking about, these are big issues to solve. The fact that the whole of our economic system is built around activity that makes sure we don't solve this stuff. The way money is created is set not to solve it. I'm also, Rajsri, when you were asked, I thought you were asking a very interesting question about where does independence sit in this? And I think lots of people, when they heard your answer, they'd be thinking, oh, we can sort these things out ourselves. But I think what you said was really important. I think that for us to contribute, we need, and for Wales to be an important independent nation, it needs to be outward facing and actually engaging on an international basis. I have a real issue with the UK being that international outward facing nation at the moment. And I think there's this is the sort of thing that we can't sit around and think we can challenge from within anymore, because our voices are just not being heard. And I think your challenge that actually young people want to see action is absolutely critical. And, we can't hide away from these things anymore. Duncan, I wrote down, I said, well, you've made me thoroughly depressed for the first 5 minutes of your talk. And then you, I think, shed some light about where we could be going. And I think the examples of the work being done is incredible. And the one thing that I just want to touch on, because I think this talks to a lot of the things we're doing, is you mentioned the two young people who would establish that effectively small holding in Crickhowell, and they paid the rent. And the word that you didn't use, but I used in place of it, is I got the impression that they acted independently. So there was an independent spirit that they were going to do things without the permission of other people. And sometimes we take too long in everything we do, waiting for somebody else to say yes. And I think if they're an example, they should be an exemplar for all of us to get off our backsides and do things rather than just wait for others. So I just think it was a hugely important contribution. And there was a phrase, I can't remember who said it, but someone said, we're not powerless, we have to participate, which is critical. And just this poll, the poll has just come up, by the way. I don't know if everyone else can see it. And if you could have one of these things, which would you choose to address climate change in Wales? So the wealth of Westminster, which is obviously quite considerable, hits 2%. So we don't think that's going to solve it. More discussion about we need to do on 20%. And then the two that are tying, be a full part of global crop cooperation. That, a full part doesn't mean just paying lip service. This is active engagement. And then the other one, an independent Wales investing in a big job creating climate cleanup. So actually doing stuff rather than talking about it. So that's quite instructive as well, I think, in terms of it. So I just want to thank you all for, I'm sure everyone else is saying the same stuff. That was huge, I think. And I think Donald's points about, it leads, doesn't it? If we're talking segues onto currency, we're going to be talking about currency in a short while. And I think that, you know, we need the tools to do the jobs that are important. And I think this is one of, this and the previous thing, poverty, are absolutely critical to what we do. So, Giacomo, thanks ever so much. I found that enlightening. Over to Caris.
That was seamless, Mark. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Diolch o galon I chi gyd, y panelwyr. What a wonderful conversation to have heard. I'm currently on a panel of writers for a project called Everything Change with Taliesin Art Centre in Swansea and Bangladesh Literature Festival called Dhaka Literature Festival. And it's about the climate crisis. And it was amazing what Katie touched on earlier, that everyone that I saw speak over the course of 10 days of being immersed in these talks, people, science and climate activists from all over the world, so many different ages as well, whether they were in Tokyo, in Bangladesh, in Austin, Texas, or Swansea. Everyone was talking about how imperialism was at the root of climate change, how you can actually just draw it back to colonization, which of course feeds into the discussions around independence.